This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. There's quite a bit to get through tonight, but let's start with a run through the markets here for you. So the NSE 20 in East Africa not setting another low today. It did rise by just about a third or so of a percent to about 26.49 points, but even at those levels, it's shed at least 1% so far in June. Top 14 Joburg, it was down again by about 1%. But Naspers has a massive weighting on the index, and its 1% decline today dragged the wider index lower. But mining stocks, they're having a stellar run. Fourth day of gains, gold prices rising to a 6-year high, certainly having something to do with that, among other factors. Here's what's coming up tonight. South Africa's cash-strapped defense firm is cutting employees' pay by 15%. Plans to nationalise Kenya's loss-making carrier are taking shape. And the UN is calling for restraint as the US unveils sanctions on key Iranian leaders. Our starting point tonight is South Africa, or more specifically one of its ailing state-owned enterprises. This time the state-owned defence group Denel is only going to be paying its employees 85% of their salaries for this month because of liquidity problems. Now, Denel has been working on a turnaround plan with the government, but so far it's failed to secure the cash injection management and the board say they need. The company struggled to pay salaries to some staff in September last year, but it since then resumed making full payments on time. It's offered severance packages to staff, and it's also trying to renegotiate some onerous contracts it got into and to exit part of its business in order to cut its costs and return to profitability. South Africa's public finances are stretched virtually to breaking point by the need to rescue ailing state-owned companies like Eskom and South African Airways, both of which are heavily loss-making. Now, the Chinese President Xi Jinping held talks with the Ugandan head of state, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, in Beijing earlier today. President Xi Jinping said that China wants to work more with Uganda on infrastructure, trade, energy, agriculture, pandemic control, industry and tourism as well. He's called for joint work on China's Belt and Road Initiative and the implementation of agreements made at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation last September. On his part, Mr. Museveni said that Uganda hopes to establish a comprehensive partnership and will strengthen communication and coordination in multilateral institutions like the UN. In the meantime, planners in Beijing have concluded a meeting to lay out a blueprint for this year's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Their efforts have caught the attention of the country's head of state, who congratulated the organizers. Xi Jinping says Chinese and African leaders will push forward with the joint construction of the Belt and Road and the African Union Agenda 2063. Now, they aim to improve the welfare of some 2.6 billion people in China and Africa. CGTN's Su Yuting has that report.
A new opportunity to bring recent summit results to fruition while improving the welfare of Chinese and African people. Those were the remarks made by Chinese President Xi Jinping in a congratulatory letter to those at the coordinators meeting on the implementation of the FOCAC summit in Beijing Tuesday. During the opening ceremony, Chinese State Council and Foreign Minister Wang Yi read the letter and delivered a keynote speech, saying he also believes this meeting will deepen friendship and trust and boost high quality and sustainable cooperation.
We always believe that China-Africa cooperation is part of international cooperation with Africa. It will not only contribute to the common development and shared interests between China and Africa, but will also create conditions for greater international cooperation. China will encourage the international community to treat Africa equally and increase investment in Africa. We will work with others to pour our strength, form synergy, and help with the development and rejuvenation of African countries, and make life more colorful and rewarding for the African people.
The Chinese and African sides both signed cooperation agreements during the meeting and issued a joint statement. While answering questions from CGTN during the press conference, Qian Keming, China's Vice Minister of Commerce, shared details of the first China-Africa Economic Trade Expo to be held in Changsha City, Hunan Province.
The theme is win-win cooperation for a closer China-Africa partnership. During the expo, there will be an opening ceremony and China and Africa Economic Trade Cooperation Forum. There will also be 4 seminars on agricultural, infrastructure and financing cooperation, bilateral trade promotion, and on the development of economic and trade cooperation.
I would like to thank the government of China for this well-organized meeting. We are always happy to come and join our Chinese friend, both bilaterally and within the forum, the China-Africa Forum, which is a good framework to discuss political issues, economic issues, investment, trade between China and Africa.
Against the backdrop of unilateralism and rising protectionism, both Chinese and African officials believe it's time for them to boost the synergy between the Chinese proposed Belt and Road Initiative with the African Union 2063 agenda. And it's time for them to safeguard multilateralism and also to boost the closer community with the shared future between China and Africa. Su Yuting, CGTN, Beijing.
All right, and so let's recap our initial top story, the focus on the South African arms maker Denel. It's one of the many ailing state-owned enterprises in South Africa. Its CEO essentially told employees earlier today that, look, we're only going to pay you 85% of your salaries for the month of June. And at the time, the CEO cited a liquidity crisis in that particular company. So what's going on and how do we fix it? Angelo Coppola joins us now live from Johannesburg with more on this story. So, Angelo, let's start with a bit of context, a bit of history, if you will. For most of us not familiar with Denel, I know them as a maker of the Red Falcon. I'm probably going to butcher its pronunciation in Afrikaans, the Hooifalk. But these guys make a lot of arms. How do they end up in such poor financial health?
Well, Raman, just a quick update. Very late this afternoon, in fact, early this evening, Pravin Gordhan, the Public Enterprises Minister, announced that a lender had stepped forward to cover that 15% salary bill that was missing. So it's going to be paid in full. Everyone will get their salaries by tomorrow. In terms of the background, well, it's seen by analysts as a combination of corruption and poor management. The South African National Defence Force, of course, has had its budget trimmed, which hasn't helped its case over the years, because without budget, the Defence Force can't buy equipment from Denel, and it also can't commission any kind of R&D, and this has hamstrung Denel because generally what's happening, according to the analysts, it couldn't export anything either because potential buyers, I'm told, look at to see if the country's armed forces are using Denel equipment, and because they want that certainty that there will be support for the life of any equipment that those buyers might buy. And that's not been happening. Of course, there are also head office overheads that have increased. There was one stage where management gave themselves a really large and, well, unexpected increase in terms of their salaries. We've seen key people that have left the organization, from management all the way down to the R&D, which has also depleted that IP that was in the company. There's also been some forex losses of around $20 million odd and erroneous contracts to the value of about 7. So it's been a culmination of issues that brings us to this point that we're sitting at right now, Raman.
Indeed. So how big a bailout does Denel require from taxpayers? And assuming, for argument's sake, assuming they do get the money, what are they going to use it for?
Well, look, it's got to pay salaries and suppliers, and of course it's got to service that huge debt that it's got. It did get a $60 million government guarantee in December to pay some of those areas. That was meant to have lasted for 6 months. It's clearly all been drawn down and obviously exhausted. So it appears that the running costs are in the region of at least $6 million a month. And here we are sitting today, 6 months later, and no news from the shareholder, which is the government, about a solution, be it a guarantee or a bailout or a turnaround plan. So it's been shtum, there's been no noise at all. Pravin Gordhan, of course, has had his hands full. His attention has been focused on what's been happening at Eskom because of that huge debt balloon there. Because, of course, if that fails, then the country and the fiscus are in deep trouble. And obviously the ratings agencies are going to be jumping in there and probably downgrade the country. So as it stands right now, any bailouts that are going to be forthcoming or any guarantees are going to be used to service the debt, which is coming up in a little while in terms of maturity. And, of course, those running costs which they need to keep the doors open, Raman.
Indeed. Let's focus on that debt in a bit more detail. As you mentioned at the very start, someone, we don't know who the institution is come in and plugged in that hole for the other 15% of employee salaries. But the company also has a rather big debt service cost due this month. About $2 million, I believe, in interest payments is due this month. Can they settle it, or do taxpayers have to step in?
Well, look, as it stands right now, Denel can't settle it. It doesn't have the money. But it's most likely that government will step up and cover that payment. If it doesn't and Denel defaults, that obviously is going to have some knock-on effects for all the other guarantees that government has put in place, most notably, of course, with Eskom and SAA. And then, of course, there are banks that will probably call their loans at that point because they'll be getting a little jittery and the shareholders will probably want some action taken. Interestingly enough, though, most of the Denel debt, we understand, is held by the PIC, which is in turn manages that government employee pension fund money. So it's quite possible that the PIC may give Denel a bit of leeway on interest payments. But on the other hand, of course, it wouldn't be fiscally prudent to do so, would it? And of course, shareholders and pension fund members would probably have something to say about that. So as it stands right now, we're not sure which way Denel or the government is going to turn, Rahman.
Indeed, massive moral hazard problem there, isn't there? But Denel also has another 3 billion rand, that's roughly $200 million in debt, that it must settle this year. And if they can't settle, well, $2 million in interest payments this month, surely that essentially suggests that the state will just have to step in and cover all those costs throughout the rest of the year.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, as I mentioned, there's that 60 million that it got in December. It's looking for some more. There's no doubt that the government's balance sheet can stand pumping some more money into now. But the question now is whether the government actually has the appetite to do that and to continue throwing bad money or good money after bad. They have been on life support, as you know, for the last 6 months. They're effectively, and that is Denel, insolvent. And 6 months to find solutions seems like a reasonable amount of time for the management of Denel to make a plan. Having said that, we know that Eskom and SAA have been trying to turn themselves around for some time now, and they haven't been able to do so. So the question of selling a stake now comes to the fore. Is the government interested in selling parts or the whole of SOEs out to other bidders? We don't know for sure. There's been no clear direction from government in that regard. Is it an option or not? We also aren't clear on that. But earlier this evening, Pravin Gordhan did mention that it was looking at selling an equity stake in SAA, and it was on the table. So it does appear that there might be some softening of the government's stance on SOEs and getting equity partners involved. Of course, it's early days. We're going to have to wait and see how this one actually plays out, Raman.
Indeed, and we've seen that script playing out and running into massive opposition in other SOEs like Eskom in the past. Let's see how this all plays out. Thank you for that. That's Angela Kopler there live in Johannesburg. Now, on to e-commerce. Jumia Food has seen a steady rise in purchases on that platform over the years. When it first set up in 2012, the Africa-focused e-commerce unit focused essentially on the middle class, if you will, those individuals who had access to regular, steady internet access. But with growing smartphone use and falling data costs in many a country, that's opened up the market to lower income earners as well. Here's CGTN's Terry Wangare now with more on the company's strategy for growth and how it intends to reach a whole new class of customers.
Jumia Food, a unit of New York-listed e-commerce platform Jumia Technologies, is offering cheaper menu options in its African home market to attract lower-income earners. The platform delivers food and drink in 11 African countries. It joins other international companies such as ride-hailing firm Uber and China's Huawei Technologies, who are looking to grow their consumer base in the continent beyond the middle class.
We're also looking now to target this mass market customer that is really starting to come online over the last couple of years, for the first time realizing that a level of radical convenience and assortment is not just the preserve of you know, the upper classes. It's now available to the mass market because the level of sophistication of technology, the level of experience that we now bring to on-demand means that we can hit a price point that's attractive to them.
Jumia Food has about 1 million customers in 30 African cities, including Nigeria's Lagos, Morocco's Casablanca, with Kenya being its biggest market. Its platform has 4,000 restaurants offering everything from local cuisine to international fast food from the likes of KFC, Pizza Hut, and McDonald's. The platform's 2019 strategy includes working with restaurants to offer relatively cheaper meals of a maximum of 300 Kenya shillings, which is an equivalent to $2.95.
You know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I considered this to be a food delivery business. And what happened over the years is that we built up a very large base of customers, and we developed an extremely deep expertise in on-demand delivery technology. And when you have those two assets, you know, we recognize that food is probably the biggest opportunity that we have in the market, but we can leverage those assets to serve customers in other areas.
Africa's growing population is expected to lead to a rise in consumer spending to $2.2 trillion by 2030 from $680 billion in 2008. This is according to a report by the United Nations Development Programme and the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. The e-commerce platform is betting that as more Africans attain middle-class status, demand for online services will increase. So far, it's looking like their predictions are bearing fruit. Since its launch in 2012, orders placed on Jumia food have grown by 7% per month. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Welcome back. So let's run through some company headlines now, starting in the beverage business. Coca-Cola is planning to build a $70 million factory in Ethiopia on about 14 hectares of land. The firm's shareholders also planning to invest another $300 million in the country in the next 5 years. That plant will have a manufacturing capacity of about 70,000 cases of beverages a day. It will be the biggest bottler and the fourth of its kind in the country. The telecommunications company Airtel Africa plans to list at least 500 million shares on the Nigerian stock market. The initial offer will comprise of between 14% to 18.9% of the firm's shares at a price of between $1.02 and $1.28. Now, the telco is also preparing to list on the London stock market, where it will be selling at least 25% of its shares. It aims to raise at least $750 million from that listing in London. In East Africa, Kenya's KCB Group and National Bank of Kenya have appointed a transition team to oversee the acquisition of 100% of the ordinary shares of the cash-strapped National Bank of Kenya. Now, the team's main task will be to mitigate the risks inherent in the deal and to make the necessary preparations to ensure the deal goes according to plan. Shareholders in both entities recently approved a deal to swap 10 ordinary shares of NBK for every 1 ordinary share of KCB at the respective annual general meetings. And finally, the U.S. parcel delivery firm FedEx has sued the U.S. government. It says it shouldn't be held liable if it inadvertently shipped products that violated a Trump administration ban on exports to some Chinese companies. Now, the move comes after FedEx reignited Chinese anger over its business practices when a package containing a Huawei phone sent to the U.S. was returned last week to its sender in the UK. FedEx at the time said that was an operational error. FedEx suit and delivery error come against a backdrop of increasing tension between the world's 2 largest economies. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. It's time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Plans to nationalise Kenya's national carrier are taking shape. We'll have the latest. And the continent's first ever summit on the wildlife economy opens up in Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened?
Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how whole stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
When world leaders speak, everybody listens. When world leaders listen, everybody benefits. Together we stand. Divided, we falter. The Group of 20 Summit in Osaka, Japan. Catch the highlights only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's dive into aviation. It's been voted as the third best carrier in Africa. We're talking about Kenya Airways, but the carrier is now seeking new ways to return to profitability after years of pretty devastating losses. KQ, as it's more commonly known, flies to 53 destinations, including New York. After years of those losses, now the airline is proposing to be taken over by the government through a state-owned holding company. CGTN's Robert Nagela has more.
After recording its worst ever performance in 2016, following 4 successive years of losses, Kenya Airways management told its shareholders at this year's AGM the turnaround strategy was bearing fruit.
In general terms, the 2018 was what I would qualify as a good year.
The reason for optimism was a reduction in the airline's losses from $250 million in 2015 to just $75 million in the last financial year.
We managed to grow our revenues by 8% due to quite increased activity of the company.
This was mainly due to a 30% expansion in connectivity to African destinations, increasing passenger volumes by about 1,000 passengers daily, and an increase in the airline's cargo business. But it's not out of the woods yet. Increased competition from other airlines and other global factors continue to cut into the airline's revenue stream.
Aircraft fuel remains the biggest portion of our costs, constituting about 40% of our total direct costs last year.
The airline is 48.9% owned by the Kenyan government, 7.8% by the Air France KLM Group, and 38.1% owned collectively by a group of 11 lenders of the company who converted their loans into equity in 2017. A proposal to allow the airline take over and operate the country's biggest airport, Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, was flatly rejected by Parliament. The airline's board has now tabled a new proposal. It involves nationalising Kenya Airways and would include a raft of tax exemptions, a proposal favoured by the government and Kenya's Parliament. If adopted, the airline would operate under a state-owned holding company. Despite the changes, the airline's future remains uncertain. Sebastian Mikos, the CEO, who was supposed to oversee the airline's flight from the red, is set to step down before year's end. His successor is yet to be announced. Robert Nagela, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
On to Zimbabwe now. The country's president, Emerson Mnangagwa, has officially opened the African continent's first ever Wildlife Economy Summit in the country's tourism capital, Victoria Falls. Now, the maiden gathering is being held under the patronage of the African Union and the United Nations Environmental Programme with the support of Zimbabwe's Environment Ministry. The three-day program has brought together experts, government leaders, key private sector players and conservationists as well to discuss how to manage the wildlife assets that are found in Africa. According to a document released at the event, Africa's consumer spending on tourism, hospitality and recreation is expected to hit $262 billion by 2030. In the meantime, up north, Egypt's fishing sector has undergone some rapid development in the last decade. It's risen exponentially to become a global production powerhouse, making it the largest producer in Africa and 8th in the world. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim reflecting on one businessman who's operating a fishery in the west of Cairo.
Mohammed Gouda owns a 40-acre fish farm in Fayoum, 100 kilometers southwest of Cairo. It overlooks the Qarun Lake. He says the fisheries business in Egypt has huge potential.
We are producing for the local market because at the moment there is a gap of 400,000 tons between production and consumption, so there is more demand than supply. We are also working with scientific institutes on an IBA system which will double fish production per acre without consuming more water or feed.
In the last 2 years, Egypt has become the largest fish producer in Africa with 1.8 million tons a year. 75% of fish production is from fish farms, not natural fishing.
These fish farms have helped push fish production up from 1.3 million tons per year in 2015 to 1.8 million tons in 2018-2019. In 2020, the production is expected to reach 2.3 million tons. This will reduce the consumption gap and create self-sufficiency for Egypt.
But it hasn't been an easy ride. Mohammed Gouda had to overcome several challenges.
We are working on issues such as the scarcity and low quality of water here. The land rental price from the government is very high. We are also in debate with authorities that have stamped real estate taxes on our fish farms. These regulations have raised cost of production and affect our output.
Once these issues are solved, Mohammed expects a further boom in the fishing industry to become a major driving force in Egypt's economy. Yasser Hakim, CGTN, Cairo.
China's focus on agriculture investment in African economies is laying the groundwork for local farmers to acquire some pretty interesting tech. In Botswana, one Chinese national is paving the way for urban farming in the country by using modern tech to grow the nation's much-needed vegetables. Here's CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy with the details.
Dexiang Zhu came to Botswana some years ago as a construction expert, but at the time he never imagined he could be living in a foreign land as a farmer, thousands of kilometers away from his homeland, China. Since then, Dexiang has been engaged in urban vegetable farming in Botswana's capital, Gaborone, and making a good living from his profitable business.
We have employed so many Chinese personnel and we are living and working abroad, so we opened this farm for self-reliance purposes to make our workers feel at home.
Dexiang's urban farm is technologically advanced and environmentally friendly. They grow vegetables year-round using minimum amounts of needed fertilizer, crop protection products and water for irrigation.
We have a long history of farming in China, so we bring in Chinese technology in farming to solve the drought here and cultivate the vegetables as good as you see.
The urban farming business not only generates revenue, but also provides employment for more than 10 local residents and day workers in the company. Both the Chinese and local citizens work together to produce a range of seasonal vegetables like lettuce and cabbage, among others. The products are usually sold to mainly company workers who directly benefit from the farm, with a very small portion of the produce supplied to hotels and restaurants, especially Chinese enterprises. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Gaborone, Botswana.
Right then, let me bring you back to East Africa with a great wildebeest migration on the plains of East Africa, from essentially the plains in Tanzania right into the Kenyan end. It's one of the world's most thrilling and intriguing displays of wildlife behavior. In Kenya, entrepreneurs are now preparing for booming business as tourists flock into the Masai Mara National Reserve to see this annual wonder. Here's CGTN's wildebeest with this report.
On one side, the wildebeest are assembling, preparing to cross over into Kenya in the great annual wildebeest migration. On the other side, business people are gathering, preparing for the tourists the migration will bring. It is one of the highlights of a visit to the Masai Mara, one of the 7 modern wonders of the world. And when it occurs, the thousands of tourists who visit will feed a whole chain of businesses, big and small. Already tourists are trickling in.
The thing that is amazing about this place is that each time you go, you see and experience something different. And plus, no matter how many times you see these amazing things, they're still awe-inspiring.
And thousands more are expected. There aren't many tourists here just yet, but with wildebeest season just around the corner, locals are determined to be prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that the season offers. The Emurutoto Women's Group sells their wares just outside the Masai Mara Game Reserve. They specialize in the beautiful beaded curios, wristbands and traditional ornaments, and wood carvings and metallic animals made of wire twisted into beautiful shapes. They are beautiful mementos of a visit to the area. They hope to sell thousands.
We hope they will visit our shops in the villages and buy our wares. And when they do, the money we will earn will buy us food and pay for our children's school fees.
They aren't the only ones. More tour guides are venturing into the park, bringing tourists who came in early. The migration is the peak of the tourist season. Last year, the park management said it expected upwards of 100,000 tourists. Many have already booked hotel rooms.
The wildebeest this time came up early. We started having wildebeest 1st of June. We had some wildebeest coming, and therefore the season started a bit earlier than usual. And we're looking forward to having more guests this time because already we have influx of clans coming to Mara, especially from Asia and Europe.
Narok County, which hosts the reserve, has plans to improve the road infrastructure. 6 airstrips serve the area. All around the Mara is an air of expectation. Locals waiting for tourists to arrive by road and by air to kick off the vibrant season. Wildebeest, CGTN, Masai Mara, Kenya.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a break. Here's what's coming up next. The UN has called for restraint as the US unveils sanctions on key Iranian leaders. And the WTO is warning that new trade barriers are rising at a faster rate than the historical average. All that and more is in the pipeline.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Perina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives. News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. These are some of the stories making your headlines at this hour, starting with China and Uganda. The two sides have agreed to lift their bilateral relations into what they describe as a comprehensive cooperative partnership. That decision was made during a meeting between the Chinese head of state Xi Jinping and his Ugandan counterpart, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, in Beijing. China will work with Uganda to promote continuous development of bilateral ties by seizing the opportunity that's been provided by the Belt and Road Initiative and implementing results from the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing. A memorial service has been held in Ethiopia for army generals killed in Saturday's foiled plot to seize control of the Amhara regional government. Hundreds of Ethiopian soldiers and those from other disciplined forces attended the event. The country's military chief, General Siare Mekonnen, was killed by his bodyguard in Addis Ababa alongside a retired army general. The regional president of Amhara state, Mbachu Mekonnen, together with his advisor, also assassinated over the weekend. The United Nations Children's Fund says that conditions in Cameroon's Anglophone regions is deteriorating fast. At least 80% of the schools there have closed in the wake of an order by Anglophone separatists. Now, the West African nation's crisis started initially with peaceful protests against structural discrimination back in October 2016. This protest then led to an armed separatist movement with Anglophone militants fighting for a separate state named Ambazonia. And finally, the UK's ruling Conservative Party says it will announce its new leader, and effectively the Prime Minister, to replace Theresa May on the 23rd of July. Two final candidates, 23rd of July, my bad. Two final candidates, the former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who's so far the favourite in the race, and the current Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, were chosen from a field of 10 by the party's 313 members of Parliament. That's a run through your headlines. Right then, let's now turn to the ongoing dispute between the United States and Iran. The UN Security Council is calling on all sides to exercise maximum restraint around the Gulf of Oman. The Council met behind closed doors on the same day that the US President imposed entirely new sanctions on Iranian leaders. Here's CGTN's Jim Spanman with the details.
The new U.S. sanctions target Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei and other high-ranking officials, plus 8 senior military commanders of the elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
These measures represent a strong and proportionate response to Iran's increasingly provocative actions. We will continue to increase pressure on Tehran until the regime abandons its dangerous activities.
The sanctions will ban those officials from doing business with U.S. entities while freezing assets in American banks.
For people who say these are just symbolic, that's not the case at all. We've literally locked up tens and tens of billions of dollars. These sanctions will come along with additional entities where people are hiding money. So no, these sanctions are highly effective.
Last year, President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, despite the International Atomic Energy Agency saying Tehran was in compliance with the agreement. Trump now wants direct negotiations with Iran to forge a new nuclear deal. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, who may be targeted for sanctions later this week, rejects the Trump administration's motives, tweeting this: "They despise diplomacy and thirst for war." Existing sanctions have taken a toll on the Iranian economy, but haven't brought officials to the negotiating table.
You cannot start a dialogue with somebody who is threatening you, who is intimidating you. Today, we just witnessed that the United States imposed another set of sanctions against Iran. How can we start a dialogue with somebody whose primary preoccupation is to put more sanctions on Iran? So the atmosphere of such a dialogue is not ready yet.
This all comes after Trump decided against military action in response to Iran shooting down an unmanned drone last week. According to published reports, the U.S. instead launched a cyber attack against Iranian military computer systems used to control its rockets and missile launchers. Iran says those cyber attacks were unsuccessful and that it remains capable of striking a U.S. drone. If that were to happen, it's not at all clear how President Trump may react. Jim Spellman, CGTN, at the White House.
Now, this, of course, is a fast-moving story, so let's bring you up to speed with the latest developments. Leah Duncan joins us now live from New York. So, Leah, looking at the numbers here, the IMF is forecasting a 6% contraction in GDP this year in Iran. Inflation is an eye-watering 37.2%. Iran's economy, by most metrics, is under severe pressure. So, What's the rationale for these latest sanctions? What do they hope to achieve?
Well, you are right. It is indeed a fast-moving story. The U.S. really wants to get Iran to negotiate with it and thought these sanctions would help this effort. And as we know, President Trump signed that executive order on Monday imposing sanctions against the country's supreme leader and foreign minister. However, Iran said that the new sanctions precluded any diplomacy and called the actions from the White House, quote, mentally retarded. Now, President Trump, he did respond on Twitter today saying, quote, Iran's very ignorant and insulting statement put out only shows they do not understand reality. Any attack by Iran on anything American will be met with great and overwhelming force in some areas. Overwhelming will mean obliteration. No more John Kerry and Obama. So clearly tensions certainly appear to be escalating. Washington says the 2015 nuclear agreement reached under Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, it didn't go far enough because it is not permanent and it does not cover issues beyond the nuclear program, such as missiles as well as regional behavior. Now, earlier today, U.S. National Advisor John Bolton, he predicted that the moves by Washington to turn up the pressure on Iran would lead it to enter negotiations. Bolton, he spoke to reporters after meeting his Russian and Israeli counterparts in Jerusalem, and he said, quote, they'll either get the point or we will simply enhance the maximum pressure campaign further. It will be, I think, the combination of sanctions and other pressure that does bring Iran to the table. As we know, of course, Iran has said it would not agree to talks with the U.S. while it is under the threat of sanctions.
Indeed. So the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he's in the Gulf countries at the moment, Saudi Arabia, UAE, essentially doing that circuit there. The U.S. envoy in Iran is also in Europe talking to U.S. allies over there. But what do these two hope to achieve in both locations?
Well, you know, they want to rally their allies in the face of this escalating crisis. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been speaking with Gulf allies, as you mentioned, and a senior U.S. State Department official said that the U.S. is building a coalition with its allies to protect Gulf shipping lanes by having eyes on all shipping following the recent attacks on oil tankers that Washington blamed on Iran. Now, Pompeo visited Saudi Arabia and he met with King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman there. He also visited the UAE, and the senior U.S. official also told reporters that the U.S. Navy was building what it called a Sentinel program for proactive deterrence. He said a coalition of nations would provide both material and financial contributions, but did not name any of the countries that are potentially involved. Reuters has also reported that a second U.S. official said that the plan aimed to have U.S. partners provide the majority of ships that would be positioned in the Gulf of Oman or the Strait of Hormuz there. Meanwhile, U.S. Disarmament Ambassador Robert Wood, he said today that President Trump is leaving a path open to diplomacy with Iran, but Iran would be making a mistake if it interprets his restraint over the downing of that drone as weakness. He also said that the U.S. will continue with its maximum pressure, of course, until there is change, and is looking for ways to even further increase sanctions. He said, quote, we will not initiate a conflict against Iran, nor do we intend to deny Iran the right to defend its airspace. But if Iran continues to attack us, our response will be decisive. Now, Wood attended a conference on disarmament in Geneva, which is actually the world's main nuclear negotiating forum, and he actually traded some pretty sharp accusations with the Iranian diplomat.
Indeed. So one last question for you, Leah. Gains in WTI and Brent crude, the two benchmarks for oil, have fallen quite a bit this week. But how are oil traders pricing in the risk of a confrontation between these two countries in the Gulf of Oman?
Well, one Mizuho analyst that I spoke with today, he said that after Iran shut down that drone over the last few days, that priced at about $4 to $7. But if things continue to escalate, of course, adjustments would be made, particularly if you are talking about the potential loss of life versus no loss of life. So those are factors that traders are watching closely. But keep in mind here, there are other factors at play, right? We've seen WTI inching higher today as investors expect U.S. data to show declining crude stocks. A Reuters poll out yesterday showed that crude oil inventories likely fell for a second consecutive week last week, while refined products were slightly up. But if the data is more bearish than expected, that can naturally pressure prices. Also, weighing on prices, of course, hopes of progress in trade between the U.S. and China. We have, of course, that highly anticipated meeting between China's Xi Jinping and President Trump coming up this week, which will be closely watched. And ahead of those talks, we had a senior U.S. official saying that President Trump was comfortable with any outcome from the talks. So a lot of concerns there as well. So while escalating U.S.-Iran tensions certainly will provide a boost for prices, there are other factors such as rising U.S. production and demand worries, of course, stemming from the U.S.-China trade issues, and that could, of course, impact demand as well. So, and henceforth prices. So while, prices can certainly get a boost as things potentially could escalate between the U.S. and China, there are other downward pressures on prices as well.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Leah Duncan there live in New York. Just to give you a sense of the sort of oil prices we're looking at the moment, Brent crude is at just under $65 a barrel, up about 0.2% at the moment. WTI actually did crest above 58 early in the trading session, but now it's slightly below that level. But we'll see where it gains, it settles at the close of the trading session. Now, speaking of Iran, American sanctions on the country are essentially pushing shoppers from expensive foreign imports to much cheaper local alternatives. Iran's domestic brands see these changes as an opportunity to gain popularity among local shoppers and maybe even get access to some overseas markets.
Shelves in the malls of Tehran are now filled with Iranian-made clothing, perfume, and leather goods. Those are attainable alternatives for domestic consumers opposed to or who can no longer afford Western imports.
Well, the prices of Iranian brands are much better because we have to pay extra customs for foreign brands and their prices always fluctuate even if we use dollars. But the prices of Iranian-made products are much more stable.
The International Monetary Fund warned in May that Iran could see its GDP contract by 6% while inflation hovers around 50%. That's the highest level since 1980. It comes as the Islamic Republic faces tighter U.S. oil sanctions coupled with a weakening currency. But the sanctions create an opportunity for domestic brands and small businesses to flower.
These days, I suppose that our customer prefer to purchase from Iranian brands because they believe in Iranian brands. They found out that the material and the average price of Iranian brand is perfect in compare of foreign brand.
Our production is growing every day, both the designs and the colors. The market is forced to develop. Progress is inevitable. If this process continues, we can even conquer the world market. Why not?
The businesses seem fully aware of their weaknesses and how competition will help them improve.
Of course, there is the issue of quality, which the customers will try to pay attention to when it comes to local brands. They will make comparisons and find out which one is better and more buyable. That way, the brands will naturally improve.
Some companies even began the process of shifting dependency from foreign to domestic supply chains as early as 2017, right after Donald Trump was elected U.S. president.
From the beginning, we thought that as Trump came to office, we would face problems. So we replaced our foreign structures with internal ones. We also lowered our expectations and sometimes didn't receive any income for months. We barely made money at first, But we got there, we reached our goal, and for the time being, we are still fighting.
所以要听 CGTN。
Now, a WTO report released on the 24th of June says that the world's 20 most advanced economies, effectively the G20, put in place 20 new trade restrictions between last October and May. And that covers trade worth about $340 billion. And all of this is happening despite the fact that the G20 economies also implemented 29 measures designed to reduce trade barriers over the same period. And the WTO is warning that these new barriers are rising at a much faster rate than the historical average. Yes, GTN's Daniel Ranges putting it into context.
US President Donald Trump's trade team has been pushing for substantial reform of the World Trade Organization, the body governing the rules-based system. Last year in Buenos Aires, the group of 20 leaders agreed to discuss proposals which would eventually need to be agreed by every WTO member country.
It is difficult to see much progress because of the diversity of the membership, and the principle there would be requiring consensus of all 164 members to agree on anything, so I don't see much progress. However, there have been discussion and proposal by different group of members, and I think that will be a live discussion.
The United States has adopted a strategy of blocking the appointment of appellate judges at the WTO to force the process of reform. In December, 2 of the 3 judges remaining in the panel will leave, which would lead to virtual paralysis of the dispute system.
If we don't have a fully functioning dispute settlement system, the work that we do will be compromised in many different ways.
The International Monetary Fund says it's essential for the United States to resolve differences with trading partners, including China, in order to create a viable path to global reform.
We believe that for the global economy to actually function well, it needs to be able to rely on a more open, more stable, transparent, more predictable, and rules-based international trade system.
The Trump administration also wants the World Trade Organization itself to reconsider the scope of its powers in interpreting trade laws. The White House wants the WTO to back away from making any rulings in which countries claim exemptions based on national security, including a case brought against the United States over steel and aluminum tariffs. Daniel Ranches, CGTN, Washington.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices here for you. So as I mentioned in that conversation with Leah, Brent crude WTI not spiking as much as you'd expect, really, considering all the events that are going on around the United States and Iran, and of course the conflicts that we're seeing in the Gulf of Oman, barely moving from this 64.90, 65 level at the moment. Gold, however, where are you? There you go, for 14.34. These are levels we've not seen in about 6 years. And this is essentially pushing forward the gold miners, particularly over at the JSE, in part because of this and the risk aversion that we're seeing from events in Iran. Gold stocks over in South Africa, they're having a really, really good time. Here's what's coming up next. Food professionals from across Africa are gathering in South Africa for an annual industry meeting. Welcome back to the program. Gauteng province is hosting the Big 7 food and beverage trade show in Africa. Now, the show brings together hundreds of global suppliers with buyers from each segment of the industry. Africa's Big 7 is also the annual meeting place for food professionals from across the continent who go there to get insight into the latest developments across the sector. Here's CGTN's Yolison Jamela with more on Grassroots tonight.
This event also serves as an annual meeting place for food and drink professionals across the continent to discuss the latest developments in the industry. It is the only food and beverage show in Africa and brings together hundreds of global buyers from significant segments of the agro-processing industry's value chain.
This trade show showcases local manufacturing capabilities in order to boost the exports of South African products while simultaneously encouraging intra-Africa trade.
The show is also an opportunity for South African companies to join over 200 exhibitors from over 40 countries and to fly the national flag in some niche food and beverage categories, such as wines, ginger hammer, soy products, and preserved fruits.
We have pavilions from China, which you can see behind me here, Poland, United Arab Emirates, Russia, Ukraine, India, Brazil. We have Algeria also here for the first time, so we have a vast range of international exhibitors.
The participating companies at this fair are funded by the Department of Trade and Industry through its Export Marketing and Investment Assistance Scheme. Entrepreneurs who are afforded an opportunity to showcase their products here are quite enthusiastic about it.
So my whole aim is to wow the consumer, for people to always enjoy every little bite, every little experience that they have with our unique candy.
At this show, we will be launching the XO, the first black-owned XO Cape Royal brandy for the African continent, 13 years old XO called Bayede Royal brandy.
The agro-processing sector is critical to the South African economy and has grown to be one of the largest manufacturing subsectors, accounting for about 24% of manufacturing gross domestic products and 3.3% of South Africa's total GDP in 2017. Yulisan Jamela for CGTN in Midrand, South Africa.
Right, then a quick run through the currencies here for you. Just going to focus on the Kenyan shilling for this segment. The Kenyan shilling for a very long time was in a very small club of currencies in Africa that are actually posting gains against the US dollar. Not anymore. 102.17 is the number we're looking at today. It actually went as high as 102.21. At those levels, it's about 0.25% weaker against the American dollar so far in the year. The question, of course, is as we get closer and closer to that October 1st deadline to essentially get rid of the old currency, switch over completely to the new one, is that number going to go any higher? We'll find out. That's it for tonight's edition of this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on this program in the last hour. There's several ways of getting your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.